Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to 30 on Thursdays, Protiviti's webinar series. Today's topic is governance, the key to unlocking SharePoint business value. 30 on Thursdays is a bi-weekly 30-minute webinar series, and the next webinar will be October 8th. We'll be talking about securing Office 365 with activity monitoring. We'll have MVP Antonio Mayo presenting that day. And if you'd like to see the full schedule of 30 on Thursdays, please visit sharepoint.protiviti.com/webinars. Today's session is being recorded, and you can view an archive of all past sessions at sharepoint.protiviti.com/archivedwebinars. And if you have questions today, please use your question window. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. Again, today's topic is governance, the key to unlocking SharePoint business value. And today we have Jason Schnurr with Protiviti presenting, and my name is Angela Grant, and I'll be moderating today. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to hand over to Jason.
Great. Thanks very much, Angela. So first, I just want to get started with making a general comment on governance. Governance, as I hope everyone will see here throughout the presentation, is a really critical aspect to being able to take advantage of all the benefits that SharePoint offers and really enable the team of business users and technology users within the organization. One thing that I've found as I've been working with many organizations on their governance plan is really there isn't a definition, a simple definition that's kind of accepted and agreed upon in the market. And so I just want to first focus on what does governance mean? What are we trying to accomplish when we take on a governance task or a governance project? Then, of course, once it's defined, talk a little bit about the value of governance. Why is it that organizations want to invest in creating a governance plan that's scalable, one that can be updated, one that can be communicated easily? And then really what are the business drivers, you know, the basis of everything that we're doing here. We've acquired SharePoint to accomplish some specific business goals, and one of the opportunities work provides to us is to be able to document, to be able to track our progress to them. Not only document and track our progress, but also make that kind of a public forum for the users by actually implementing our governance plan within a SharePoint site. So it's really important to communicate to all of the folks that will be using this solution, you know, sort of parameters, how you use it, what the value is, and what benefit the organization is getting from it. So those first 3 points there, I look at as making the case for governance as an area of focus. I realize that some attendees maybe in their mind have already made that case and are ready to take a look at an approach, ready to take a look at how best to do the work to get the action items documented. So we'll spend the majority of our time on the approach, but I do want to spend some time up front here for others who may be sort of dipping their toe in the governance water, want to know a little bit more about what governance really could mean to the organization. And then what frequently happens is really there needs to be a case made internally for dedicating resources and dedicating time to the pursuit of achieving an information governance strategy that is not only taking care of immediate priorities but also looks to the future. So as I was talking there, I advanced to a slide that has what I think is an effective definition of governance. Without reading it all, it really focuses on structures, people, policies, procedures, and controls. You know, controls are necessary because we want to secure our information. But from my perspective, in my experience working with organizations, really engaging the people, understanding the business processes, the procedures that we want to be able to achieve by leveraging SharePoint is really the important part. Security is always going to be a piece of it, but it seems to me that a lot of folks, when they think of information governance, kind of immediately go to security and start to think about how we're limiting people's access to information and the ability for them to get useful information from the solution, when really governance should be something that is enabling teams to better make use of the investment we've made in technology. So we'll take a look at that in more detail as we go along. But within that definition, it refers to immediate and future requirements. So of course, we're always going to have requirements. And the rest of that list there is really for you to consider what's important at your organization. Small private companies might not have a lot of concern around regulatory compliance. Of course, all public companies would, etc. So governance need not be something that is complex and a project that lasts months and months and years, as defining policies and processes and making sure that you're communicating that actively to your team. For smaller companies, that can be an effort that for larger companies, of course, it's harder to say. But my point here is I want to make sure that we kind of take some of the mystery out of what governance is. So first, consider in this case we're talking about information governance related to information within SharePoint. SharePoint, as everyone knows, it's just a platform that offers services. The only reason we have SharePoint is so that it's convenient to get information, so that it's convenient to provide information, so that it's convenient to get relevant and accurate updates on information important to you as an employee. We're talking about an intranet in the same place reliably, right? That's what SharePoint does for us. And so what does it mean to govern it? So we provide a set of guidelines for everyone's usage. Make it clear to everyone what information they can expect to get. Make it clear to everyone how we look at, for example, security, why some have access to more than others, which should be a pretty understandable thing. The importance there is communicating actively. And then, of course, once everyone kind of understands what they're supposed to be doing with SharePoint, it's a matter of making it easy to do that. So when I talk about enhanced capability or productivity, the user experience really does have a lot to do with, and it is combined with the effort around governance. And then of course we want to make sure that once the policies and procedures and usage specifics are in place, that when changes need to be made, when we're upgrading, when we're offering new services, that can be done in a predictable way that doesn't disrupt everyone's use of the solution. Okay, so now that we have hopefully some the term defined and understand some of the value of it, a way that I suggest you might talk to your colleagues if it's necessary within your organization is not necessarily to go through the details we just reviewed together. While that's great background information, we may just tell everyone that the reason that governance is important is we want to secure our information. We want the user experience around this solution to be one that is of high quality so that we can create adoption of the solution that is sustainable. And so the level lower than that, why are those three things important? Well, we're taking out some of the risk of having all of this data, some of which may be private, some of which certainly is private, on this web-based solution, right? So with the correct security parameters in place, we eliminate the risk of important information being breached, compromised, or lost. Then also kind of straddling security and user experience is we're standardizing processes so that we understand where our information is. We're not losing information either by result of breach or just by result of users put information in and don't categorize it appropriately and then get frustrated when they can't find it. So we're standardizing those processes across those two realms, which should result in enhanced productivity across the board. And importantly, something that's been frankly hard to achieve within SharePoint or any major ECM, any major software investment, is really being able to measure and realize the value of that investment back to the organization. So if anyone asks you what governance is and they want to talk about it and you want to show something that suggests just using this one simple slide and talking through the benefits there in the middle, or the areas of focus there in the middle, and the benefits from those areas of focus across the bottom. So then let's just dive briefly here into what the market is seeing. What is the perspective from, not necessarily Protiviti or myself, but organizations like Gartner, organizations like the Association for Information Management? Well, Gartner said that most organizations don't govern well, and if you read the report they published in February 2015, it really is pretty surprising the lack of focus that organizations have on governance. And this isn't just around SharePoint, it's around major software applications and being able to advise users on both the protection of data, the way to be able to find data effectively, and the way to be able to contribute data effectively. So that report makes a pretty strong case for governance, and even says that strategy and governance are arguably the two most important processes. And then Association for Information Management sort of goes further and goes deeper into specifically SharePoint, and that much greater than half, 63% of all deployments are stalled or struggling. And it's really not because of the technology, right? I mean, SharePoint's not perfect. No software application will be. But it's really a lack of support from senior management, lack of planning, not enough training, all of those things that a good governance planning and strategy can help organizations to overcome. And then just some of the things from the study that we did in 2015. Integration of planning and business strategy is one of the highest governance priorities for IT executives. And really that's what governance is all about. Right? Our business strategy is what should be, the ability to execute our business strategy is what should be enabled by this governance of this technical solution. Right? So then now let's just focus on the business piece of it. What are the drivers for doing this? We saw in that one graphic that I showed earlier that security, user experience, and adoption are really why we want to invest in governance. So, security, one of the biggest stories around a breach of information from SharePoint is the Edward Snowden story, right? So he was a consultant at a government agency. He was a consultant that had permissions within SharePoint that probably went beyond what he should have had, and so then therefore he had access to all of the data that agency was storing on the SharePoint site. Clearly, a governance failure there, because consultants should not have access to all the private data, whether it's a government organization or a private organization or a public organization's information. Right? So that's an example of overcoming a security risk by having an effective governance plan. And then the user experience is really important around governance, because frankly governance doesn't mean anything, the investment in SharePoint or any other enterprise tool doesn't mean anything if users can't use it well. If people get frustrated and they start to go back to saving things on shared drives or their desktops, and then they're emailing around documents because they just don't trust the system, that's going to make everything break down. So a focus on user experience really needs to be part of how we're creating our governance strategy and activities that we're engaging in going forward. Just as an example, if you're deep in SharePoint, if you just talk about things like leveraging metadata, right? That's something that is a simple activity that everybody can take part in when they place information in SharePoint, that's really going to drive a more significant user experience by enabling the search tool effectively. And everybody that uses these solutions are a consumer, and every consumer in the world is used to going to whatever website they use, Google or Bing or Yahoo, and typing in a word and getting thousands of results. So given that our consumers of this, both governance strategy and the application they're supposed to use, are used to that type of convenience, we need to focus on providing that same type of convenience in the office, or we're going to have a lot of frustrated users. So then all that leads to the sustainable adoption of the solution, which again is the only way that organizations can realize value from these very significant investments that have been made. And sustainable adoption is not just people going to SharePoint to find things, but actually buying into the value, right? If you're collaborating with your colleagues on a specific project on a SharePoint site, you're making changes and you can see in real time what your colleagues are doing, that's just going to be a lot more effective and efficient than emailing documents around and getting people confused. I realize I've touched on a very high level benefit within SharePoint, but those kinds of things being pushed out to the business user community is what's going to drive the adoption from that community. So just some more information. I mentioned that we have at the top with the NSA leak, but this is information I think is going to be useful for you to have, again, to make that case. I'm not going to go through all this information specifically, but one of the things to point out there is Information Security Magazine tells us that 67% of SharePoint users have no security policy, and that's just not going to be something that's sustainable in the future. So overcoming that by having a governance plan is something that we'd strongly advise. One of the things that's interesting there, it might be really surprising to hear that type of statistic, but in my experience, it's nothing more than organizations just not placing value on the work necessary to create an effective governance plan. Similar to it being pretty common for organizations not to place enough value on driving adoption, on educating business users on how best to use the solution, because partly Microsoft does such a great job marketing SharePoint, it seems like it would be so simple. If you know how to use Outlook, you know how to use SharePoint, and that's just not the case. So focusing on organizing our work within the solution is going to be really beneficial, and in the areas of pushback that I've seen and helped organizations to overcome is, why do we need to invest all this? It's just another Microsoft technology. Well, you know, SharePoint as an enterprise content management tool is a widely dispersed application framework. It's not just a point solution. So those are things that we should really keep in mind as we're building the case to put into place an effective governance plan. And I talked a little bit about user experience, again, enabling productivity, metadata, taxonomy. And then I think what's really important to take from this is, you know, let's understand what our governance policies are. What is it that we want this tool, SharePoint, to be able to deliver to us, and then be able to match those policies to the out-of-the-box capabilities of SharePoint. We don't want to get into a lot of custom development to do things. SharePoint is pretty flexible, and once you know what you want to do, which is the important thing, then we can enable the users to be able to access that information and be able to take that action within SharePoint effectively. And then just a little comment here on sustainable adoption, you know, which leads to realizing a return on investment. We've put in that graphic is the strategy that we follow with clients. We would suggest something similar for any organization, whether you're working with us or not, is to really understand your staff's capability to use the solution, right? Understand what you need them to be able to do, right? So you're assessing capability, you're establishing the objectives, providing some sort of training, and then being able to measure those outcomes, which is just as simple as reissuing the capability assessment that was initially sent out to the user group. So what this is to mean is we would not suggest that everyone who's supposed to use SharePoint goes to the, you know, all-encompassing 8-hour, one-day training class that goes over everything SharePoint, and they're kind of drinking from a fire hose and really don't take context away. From an adoption perspective, it's really important to provide context. And I'm thinking of business users because 90–95% of all SharePoint users are business users. We don't need to maybe have as much sort of care and feeding around, obviously, the technical experts, but that's not who we're addressing here. We want to be able to enable the entire staff so that using SharePoint becomes second nature like the rest of the Microsoft tools they're used to, and we can go on to using it more effectively for the organization. Oops. Went the wrong way. So just to kind of summarize the first piece here, you know, impacting the business, one of the concerns around spending time on information governance is, you know, it's going to slow down the way that we use the solution while we put all these rules in place. Actually, it should be quite the opposite of that, right? It should be driving efficiency, focused on security, focused on productivity, focused on adoption. And what's key to that is that the business, executive, business users are part of the plan. And so how do we do that? How do we engage our team? How do we actually take the action and build this information governance plan that's going to help us to get more value out of this investment? So this graphic just shows in kind of a one-page form the methodology that we encourage our clients to use. And we'll go through these in detail, but kind of starting with having that committee together, which should have executive sponsorship and should have representation from, obviously, information technology. Information technology is going to take a central role in governance. But the business unit leaders are also going to take a central role, because it can't be information technology pushing everything out to the business users. There has to be a partnership between the two. It just is too much to expect the information technology staff to be able to do that. And of course, within the middle there, the idea is secure our data and allow people to use the solution effectively. So that's an overview, but let's drill into the details there. And one of the biggest questions that we always hear, with clients we've been working with, to maybe do an upgrade or to implement SharePoint for the first time, within governance is, where do we start? There are so many things that we could consider as we create a governance strategy. Well, what is it that we need to focus on first? Well, as I mentioned, getting the committee together that's a cross-functional group. For some organizations, that may very well be 3 or 4 people. For some organizations, that could be 6, 7, 8. I would say keep it to under 10. You don't want to have such a large governance committee that the progress gets bogged down. So that main committee would have probably less than 10 people, and then you might bring on folks that have specialized areas of focus appropriately throughout the effort. The first task of that committee is to define the roles and responsibilities across the organization. So this can be as simple as we have people with technical areas of focus. We have what we'll call power users. Maybe those folks can administer security on team sites, as an example. And then we have business users, which is everybody else. We want them to use the document management capabilities. We want them to, if we use something like the collaboration tools, Yammer, or whatever it might be, we want them to participate in the discussion, etc. So before we go into the actual specific functional areas, one of the things I might suggest is once you have the committee together and you talk about roles and responsibilities, just have this simple sort of 1 or 2 pager in terms of the topics. Those will remain the same. What are the activities that you need to take part in? I've filled in some of the roles and responsibilities, common activities, and then what are the desired results? So before we take it out to the greater group, we need, within this core team, within the governance committee, to agree on the desired results across all of these topics, which will really help us to focus our work. So that's one thing that I'd really encourage you to do before you move on to taking a look at things like operational and IT administration, right? What are the management processes, disaster recovery, backup, and storage needs? That's really important. But first, before you go into too much detail, what is it that you want to get out of it? What are the expected results, right? So is it that we want to be able to communicate a clear backup strategy that happens on a consistent schedule, for example? And then configuration and processes, that gets a little bit more specific into SharePoint, of course. So site structure, what can the site owner do? Can the site owner decommission sites? They can very likely create them. Can they control security? Do they have to inherit security from a parent site? All those kinds of things. And then talking about security on a higher level, from farm level controls to basic user authentication. Most organizations are using Active Directory to authenticate folks to the SharePoint, which is certainly a best practice. But then once the users are within SharePoint, how are we enabling them to find information, or if they're restricted from finding certain information, how are we security trimming that information out so that when they search, they don't get inactive links, they just don't have access to those things that they don't have permissions to view. And then, of course, content management. For some organizations, you stop at content management. Others, you also add the regulatory compliance piece. But around records management, around the length of time that we're retaining information, archiving, etc. What are the policies and procedures there? And then the last few functional areas, social collaboration, the ones that we just reviewed are going to really be in play at every organization, however large or small. For some, social collaboration may or may not be that important, but I include it there because it's gaining in popularity if you're using even the basic SharePoint collaboration tool set or Yammer, certainly there should be some governance and some strategy around the way that Yammer specifically is used. I touched on training and user adoption, but again, I really think that these last two pieces here, training and user adoption, are things that are kind of underserved in most governance plans because, again, traditionally governance is thought of as those things that we're defining that people shouldn't do, you know, protecting the information as opposed to both protecting information and enabling staff. So a good governance plan does take into account how we're training the different audiences, right? Again, to use the very simple terms, our business users. What are we adding to that business user training for power users? And on what schedule are we providing that training? Is that something that's available on demand on the site to encourage greater user adoption? So just as kind of a summary on actually developing the plan and the key areas of focus, you know, starting with, as part of the governance committee, you know, a limited number of folks, we're defining the roles and responsibilities across the organization, then talking about how we're actually setting up the solution, right, with an eye toward having a user experience that encourages repeat visits, that actually creates productivity and isn't just the replacement to shared drives. It needs to bring more to that to encourage people to change and to make use of it. And then, you know, how are we making the use of the solution efficient, or how are we making sure that the information is valid? So we want to make sure that we don't have site proliferation, but we also want to be flexible enough to allow the right people to create sites when they're needed. And then, of course, security controls, as I've mentioned many times, is a really important part of it, but it is just a part of the governance plan, and then determining your needs across the user community. So just to kind of wrap up, you might wonder, okay, well, what does the kind of completed action items that we first started with, you know, what might that look like? So you recall that we had a few activities around roles and responsibilities, and I've just put in some other activities that are very common, you know, probably just trying to hit on the high level ones, and I'm sure you could add other ones that are more specific to your organization. But I thought it would be helpful for everyone to kind of take this away, not only the activities that we're engaging in, but also the expected results. Many of yours might be very similar. Everybody needs a security policy that aligns with business priorities, but you may have things to add, and I thought that this would be a useful way to wrap up the presentation, and hopefully something that you can take and as an example within your organization. So with that said, that's all the content that we had to offer today. I don't know if anybody has any specific questions. I'll give you some time to think about those, but in the meantime, again, as Angela mentioned, my name is Jason Schnorr, and my contact information is there, and Angela was nice enough to moderate the session for us today. Great, so thanks very much, everyone, and have a great afternoon.